They say a heart hardened by time and pain can break silently, unnoticed. That's exactly how I encountered old farmer Thomas McAllister, a man who seemed to have forgotten what it was like to feel hope or affection. There, in the arid heart of Texas, his farm was as dry and lonely as his soul. No one approached, no one dared cross the rusty fence that marked its boundaries. And even those who passed by chance swore that Thomas was no more than a shadow of his former self, living only because his body still held on. The few times I saw him from afar, he was always the same. Hat pulled down to his eyebrows, a lost look in his eyes, his steps slow and heavy, like someone carrying his own grave on his back. His reputation was well known around town. A man who had buried all his dreams along with the family he'd lost years earlier in a merciless winter. Since then, McAllister had become a specter of flesh and blood, cultivating nothingness, waiting for the end. But everything changed the day a little girl with wide eyes and threadbare clothes appeared at his door, carrying only an old blanket and a look no one else dared offer: hope. Share this story to reach further, subscribe to the channel, share this video on WhatsApp, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'll be very happy to read each comment. It was at that moment, under a sky the color of rust and dust, that the improbable happened. McAllister opened the door, not just to the house, but to something inside him he hadn't even known still existed. I need to tell you this story because it's not just about loss, but about encounters. Prepare to experience the most unexpected chapter in old Thomas's life, beginning exactly where it seemed it would end. Let's go together to Chapter 1. Thomas McAllister wasn't born a bitter man. Years before, he was one of the most respected cattle ranchers in Texas, owner of seemingly endless land and a family that made his heart swell with pride. His wife, Mary Ann, was the brightest light in his life, and his young son Caleb, his greatest joy. The ranch throbbed with life, with workers singing as the sun rose and children running between the stables. It was a living painting of the rural American dream. But fate, with its cruel and silent hands, began to erase every color from that canvas. The winter that devastated the region that year was the most merciless on record. The snows arrived without warning, thick and heavy, covering everything in a deathly white. Roads disappeared, supplies failed, and soon fever began to haunt every house, every room. When Mary Ann fell ill, there was no doctor who could penetrate the ice barriers. And when Caleb began coughing incessantly, despair gripped Thomas. He spent entire nights awake, trying to warm the house, improvising remedies, praying to a God who seemed to have forgotten him. Each dawn, Thomas gazed at the weakened bodies of his wife and son, feeling time slip away like sand through his fingers. Until one morning, the silence was deeper than ever. Mary Ann couldn't resist. Caleb, exhausted, followed suit hours later. Thomas found himself alone, surrounded by a world of snow, cold, and death. The scream he let out that morning echoed across the fields, but no one heard him. And it was at that moment that he decided he would love nothing or anyone anymore. Because to love was to lose, and to lose was to die inside. The years that followed were spent in neglect. The fences fell, the animals disappeared, and the house began to rot from the inside out. Just like him. What was once a thriving farm was now a graveyard of memories. Thomas withdrew from the world, rejected visitors, chased away curious onlookers, and never again allowed anyone to cross his property. He ate the bare minimum, slept only what was necessary, and lived without living. Everyone in town knew McAllister was a living corpse, waiting for his body to give out. But the human heart is a stubborn thing, and even covered in ice and pain, it still beats, it still hopes. And the old farmer, though he wouldn't admit it, still held within him a wisp of something he couldn't name, until that childish gaze and that patched blanket touched his chest like a warm breath in an eternal winter. It was a late afternoon that promised only more of the same. The sky overcast with grey, the wind howling through the cracks in the old house, and the irritating sound of wood creaking under the weight of years. Thomas McAllister was simply staring into the void through the dusty window when a colorful figure broke the monotony of the evening. At first, he thought it was an animal, perhaps a coyote or a stray deer. But as the figure approached, the old farmer's disbelief overcame him. It was a girl, small, dirty, with matted hair and a look that belied her frail body. She dragged herself along the dirt path as if carrying the whole world on her shoulders. When she finally reached the porch, all she carried was a threadbare blanket so patched it looked as if it had been worn for generations. He didn't immediately give her name. She just looked at him with a kind of quiet dignity that was unsettling, a look that said, "I didn't come here to beg, just to exist." Thomas was slow to open the door. Inside, he was fighting a battle he didn't even know he was fighting. Something inside him screamed to expel her, as it had so many others who dared cross his lands. But there was something in that gaze, a glow that not even the dirt could erase. It was the same glow he'd seen in Caleb's eyes, his son, when he'd tried to be brave in the face of fever. The old man's hand hesitated on the rusty doorknob, but finally he turned it. The door creaked loudly, as if protesting this unusual gesture. He stood still, staring at the girl, waiting for her to explain her presence. She didn't. She simply held out the blanket, as if it were the entry pass to a place she already knew was difficult. Thomas, without quite understanding why, took the fabric in his hands. It was rough but still held a hint of warmth, and it was in that brief contact that the past began to stir within him, like a bear waking from a sleep too long. She finally spoke, her voice weak but firm. "I have nowhere to go. I only have this here." Thomas didn't know what to say. Since when had anyone dared to ask him for anything? Since when had anyone seen him as a chance for shelter and not a threat? The old farmer wasn't prepared for this. Still, instead of closing the door, he stepped aside, making room. A simple gesture, but one that cost his wounded and frozen pride dearly. The girl entered without thanking him, without fear, and the silence between them weighed more than 1,000 words. As she settled into a corner of the room, hugging her blanket, Thomas realized that for the first time in years, he was no longer alone. And this realization was as uncomfortable as a healing wound. That night, the wind blew differently. It was still cold, still dry, but inside the house something was beginning to change. Thomas watched the girl from afar, trying to decipher what the hell fate was up to by placing her there. She slept, curled up, but with a slight smile on her lips, as if finally finding a place to rest her weary body. The farmer tried to convince himself it was just for that night, that he would soon find a way to send her away. But deep down, he knew. He knew that door would never open the same way again, not the one to his home, nor the one to his heart. The first few days were filled with pure estrangement. The girl woke early, even before the sun began to paint the sky orange and purple. Silently, she walked around the house with the lightness of someone who didn't want to disturb, but her curiosity always betrayed her. She touched the antique furniture, gazed at the dusty portraits, and inquired with her eyes about every story those walls hid. Thomas, for his part, pretended not to notice, but her every gesture was a fine needle piercing his cocoon of solitude. The girl didn't ask his name, didn't make demands. She simply existed there, a living reminder that life could still occupy that forgotten space. Silently, she began to help, sweeping the floor, dusting the furniture, caring for the few remaining chickens. It was as if she instinctively knew that to remain there, she needed to make herself useful. Thomas watched everything from afar, grumpy, muttering to himself that it couldn't last. But in every corner the girl touched, a little bit of the house seemed to awaken. The smell of dust gave way to the scent of clean wood, and the windows, previously always closed, began to let in the sun. The farm, which had been nothing but a scene of death, slowly began to resemble a home. Still, the old man resisted. He was afraid of forming bonds, of becoming attached, of losing again. And this fear made him rude, impatient. Often, For no reason at all, he would tell the girl to stop, walk away from her, and lock himself in his room. But she, patient as water that carves through stone, remained there, demanding nothing in return. It was one of those mornings that Thomas saw her sitting on the porch, hugging her old blanket, staring at the horizon as if waiting for someone to come and get her. The sight disturbed him deeply. He felt a lump in his throat that he couldn't swallow. And then, for the first time, he asked, "Why don't you leave?" The girl looked at him, her brown eyes shining with a gentle sadness, and replied, "Because no one's waiting for me anywhere. Here, at least the wind won't blow me away." It felt like a punch to the farmer's chest. Suddenly, he saw himself in that look, a castaway without an island, clinging to a piece of driftwood in the middle of the ocean. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in the rocking chair, staring at the sleeping girl in the corner of the room, clutching the blanket. The old fabric was so worn it seemed about to fall apart. But there was something about it, a scent, a warmth, a memory Thomas couldn't decipher. Without realizing it, he began to wonder who she really was, where she came from, what she had lost, to leave only that blanket. And for the first time in a long time, the old farmer wanted to know. He wanted to understand. Because somewhere deep down he already knew. That girl and that blanket carried a story capable of redeeming his very soul. Time passed slowly on that farm, forgotten by the world, but at night, the clock seemed to stop completely. It was when the silence became absolute that Thomas heard what he would never admit to anyone. The girl's suppressed crying. It wasn't loud, nor desperate. It was a muffled sob, a timid wail that tried not to wake anyone, but which pierced the walls like a whisper of ancient pain. Every time darkness enveloped the house, she would curl up in the corner, hugging the blanket, and let her tears flow hidden between the scraps of that worn fabric. Thomas listened to it all from the next room, his chest tight and his eyes fixed on the moldy ceiling, feeling like each sob was a thorn driven into his weary heart. He didn't know what to do. He wanted to ignore it, but he couldn't. Her crying echoed his own early mornings, when years ago he'd writhed in longing for his wife and son. Those sounds reopened wounds he'd preferred to keep buried. But there was something different about that childish cry. It was the sound of someone who still had hope, who cried not only from pain, but from a desire to be embraced, to find a place the world had denied them. And then, one of those nights, Thomas couldn't take it anymore. He got out of bed, stepping awkwardly on the floor, and approached the girl. She pretended to sleep, but her eyes, swollen from crying, gave her away. Unsure of what to do, he simply sat beside her, without touching, without saying anything. The blanket enveloped her completely, like a protective cocoon. It was there, amid the silence broken by sobs, that Thomas asked for the first time, "That blanket, where did it come from?" The girl took a moment to answer. She pressed the fabric to her face and with a choked voice murmured, "It was my mother's. She said that as long as I had it, I would never be alone." The words pierced Thomas like a lightning bolt. A simple piece of cloth, old and almost shapeless, was what kept that child from collapsing completely. It was the last remnant of a lost love, a thread connecting him to someone who would never return. Thomas couldn't hold it back. Without realizing it, tears began to well in his tired eyes, tears he thought would dry forever. He wept silently, without her noticing, and as he looked at the blanket, he realized that each patch told a story, each stitch an attempt to keep alive the memory of a home gone. The girl, even though afraid, had chosen to fight oblivion, and this, for Thomas, was like a brutal mirror. He had buried his memories along with the bodies, but she clung to what she had, however simple. In that moment, the old farmer understood that the blanket was not just a piece of cloth, it was a symbol of resistance, of enduring love. And for the first time in decades, he felt the urge to protect someone again. The next morning, Thomas woke up different. The weight on his back seemed heavier, but his heart was restless, beating like a forgotten drum that begins to beat again. He went downstairs, saw the girl playing with a twig in the yard, the blanket always close by, like a faithful dog. And then, unable to contain the turmoil within him, the old man fell to his knees in the middle of the living room. The tears came hard, without asking permission. He wept loudly, shamelessly, without modesty. He wept for everything, for the wife he couldn't save, for the son he didn't see grow up, for the years of loneliness, for the words he never said, and for the doors he kept closed. He wept because finally someone had shown him that he was still human. The frightened girl ran inside. She found Thomas there, hunched over, a giant doubled over with grief. Unsure of what to do, she approached slowly, and in a pure, simple and powerful gesture, draped the blanket over the old man's shoulders. My mother used to say that when the world weighs on you, this blanket helps you remember that it's still worth staying, she whispered. Thomas held the fabric tightly, as if it could keep him from sinking completely. The girl's scent, the warmth of the cloth, all of it was like a hug from beyond. A hug he'd waited so long for, but never believed he would receive. There, kneeling on the cold living room floor, Thomas repeated softly, like a mantra, "I didn't want to stay anymore. I didn't want to stay anymore." The girl, not fully understanding, but feeling the gravity of the moment, simply sat beside him and rested her head on his shoulder. The silence returned, but this time it was a different silence, a silence full of presence, of sharing. That morning, McAllister was no longer the same. Something inside him had shattered, yes, but from the shattered fragment something new was born, a timid will to live, to protect, to begin again. And in that wordless embrace, something sealed between them, a silent promise. He wouldn't leave her alone again, and she, somehow, had saved a man who was already dead inside. All because of a blanket, a piece of fabric that carried the weight of an entire world. After that day, Thomas never looked at the girl and her blanket the same way again. A new feeling drove him to want to know more, to understand the story that brought her there. So one afternoon, as the sun rested lazily on the horizon and the scent of earth warmed by the day's heat hung in the air, he sat on the porch and called to her with a simple gesture. The girl approached suspiciously, her blanket dragging along the wooden floor. Thomas took a deep breath, as if opening a forgotten chest of courage, and asked, "Tell me, where do you come from? Why is this blanket so important?" She hesitated, her eyes lost in memory. But then she began to speak, her small voice competing with the sound of the wind among the dry trees. She said the blanket was made by her mother, while they were still living in a small village in New Mexico. Each piece of fabric was a fragment of old clothes, of lived stories, of happy moments. Her mother always said, "This blanket will remind you that every piece of our lives matters, even the ones that hurt." When the fever reached the village, taking almost everyone, her mother resisted as long as she could. But before leaving, she covered her daughter with the blanket and said the last words she would never forget. "As long as you have it, I'm here." The girl ran away, walking alone, hungry, scared and cold, until chance, or fate, led her to the rusty fence of the McAllister farm. Thomas listened in silence, his face hardened by time and pent-up emotion. Each word the girl said was a blade cutting through the barriers he'd built within himself. He saw in her a reflection of what his son Caleb had once been, fragile, yet resilient, pained, yet filled with quiet courage. And as he touched the blanket, carefully, as if handling a treasure, he felt it wasn't just fabric. It was a legacy of love, an invisible thread that still connected the girl to her mother. And for a moment Thomas envied that child, because even alone she had a reason to go on, something the old man had lost so long ago he couldn't even remember what it was like to have. The conversation continued into the night, with the girl talking about fond memories, smells, and songs her mother sang to dispel her fear. Thomas listened, absorbing every detail like a thirsty man before a deep well. In the end, she said something that remained etched in the farmer's soul. "I just want a place where I can sleep, without fear of forgetting my mother. And there, on that porch lit by the shy moon, Thomas made a silent vow. The girl would, indeed, have a home. Not just a roof over her head, but a place where she could keep every memory, every affection, alive. And he, for the first time, would have someone to care for again. In that instant, Thomas realized that the girl's blanket wasn't just a symbol of her past. It was an invitation for him to start over, an invitation he wouldn't refuse. The days that followed were unlike anything Thomas had known in years. The farm, once abandoned, began to take on a new rhythm. He rose earlier, swept away the accumulated dust, fixed doors that had creaked for too long, and cared for the few remaining animals with a dedication he no longer knew he possessed. The girl followed by his side, watching, learning, helping whenever she could. She laughed shyly when he taught her how to cultivate the crops, or when he spoke of the old days when the farm was teeming with life. Her presence was like a fresh breeze in a land that no longer believed in spring. The old farmer, previously hunched and silent, began to tell stories. He spoke of Mary Ann, of Caleb, of the days when the fields were a sea of green beneath the endless blue Texas sky. And the girl listened to everything with attentive eyes, as if each story were a brick rebuilding what time had tried to tear down. She brought music back to that place, not with songs, but with the sound of light footsteps, quiet laughter, the clink of water buckets. The farm breathed again, and with it, Thomas's heart. Over time, the old man built a small room for the girl, simple but cozy. He sewed a new quilt himself, trying to imitate the patches on the blanket she loved so much. It was a gift delivered without ceremony, with just a look that said, "You have a home here." The girl smiled, a wide smile that lit up every corner of the house. Thomas never forgot that moment. That night, sitting on the porch, he looked up at the sky and whispered to anyone who would listen, "Mary Ann Caleb, I'm taking care of her. Maybe finally I'm fulfilling my promise to be a good man." And so, without grand gestures or empty promises, the farm was reborn. Greenery timidly returned to the fields, the sheds took on new life, and laughter echoed between walls that had previously known only the echo of emptiness. Thomas rediscovered the joy of teaching, of sharing, of waiting for tomorrow. And the girl, now strong and courageous, knew she had finally found what she had always sought, a place to call home. All thanks to an old blanket and to a man who learned, late but still in time, that it was worth staying. Time passed, and the lonely days that once defined the McAllister farm became but a distant memory, nearly erased by the sound of new mornings and the scent of the fresh wood that old Thomas had worked. Years later, anyone passing along the dirt road would see a vibrant, colorful farm with green fields and a porch always occupied by two figures, an old man with a sweet gaze and a young woman who no longer carried the blanket in her arms, but always left it carefully folded over the chair like a relic of a time that could not be forgotten. That girl, who arrived barefoot and with a lost look in her eyes, was now a daughter of the heart, even if it was never said aloud. Love that was made of gestures, of glances, of comfortable silences that only those who have suffered in silence can understand. Thomas grew even older, but unlike before, he grew older smiling, each wrinkle a map of the path he'd taken from pain to rebirth. He no longer needed much to feel complete. All it took was hearing the laughter of the young woman he'd once considered sending away. All it took was smelling the fresh bread she was learning to bake. All it took was remembering that someone was waiting for him at the end of the day. And every night before he went to sleep, he'd touch the old blanket, now carefully stored like a treasure, and he'd think, "Thank you for coming to me, for reminding me that it was still worth it to stay." Some afternoons, sitting on the porch, Thomas would talk to himself, or seem to, but the truth was, he was talking to the good ghosts of his past. He would tell Mary Ann and little Caleb about the daughter life had given him, about the new colors of the farm, about the old heart that had finally beaten strong again. The emptiness that had once lived there was replaced by a warm longing, by a constant presence of affection and gratitude. It was as if he had somehow been given a second chance to do what he couldn't before. The blanket, now more patch than cloth, had become an eternal symbol in that house. It wasn't just a piece of fabric, but a daily reminder that love, even when it loses its original form, remains warm within those who choose to cherish it. And the girl, now a woman, always said, "This blanket saved me, but it was you who gave me a home." Thomas would smile, his eyes welling, and quietly reply, "And it was you who saved me from myself." Because deep down, he knew they had both met at the right time, when all seemed lost, but fate still had plans. So old McAllister left one day quietly, like someone falling asleep after a long day of work well done. But he didn't go alone. He carried in his heart the certainty that love always finds a way to be reborn, even in the driest soil. And on the porch, the blanket still lay there folded, like a whisper from the past that said, "It's still worth it, always worth it." This story, my friend, is not just about an old farmer and an orphan girl. It's about me, about you, about all of us who have thought about giving up, who have believed nothing would make sense anymore. How many times has life broken us in such a way that we thought there would be no more glue, no more light, no more road, and then someone appears. Or a gesture, or even a blanket, simple, old, but full of history, something that reminds us that it's still worth staying, because there's always a reason to stay, even if we can't yet see it. So, if this story touched your heart, I ask you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Someone, somewhere, may be about to give up, and perhaps this narrative will be the blanket they need to warm their weary soul. Subscribe to our channel, because here every story has the power to transform someone's day. Leave a comment about where you're listening to this story from. I'd love to hear it and respond to each one. Let's create a chain of affection, hope, and humanity. And don't forget, keep watching the channel's videos, because there's always another story to warm our hearts, to renew hope, to remind us that even in the driest places, love can always blossom. Thank you so much for listening this far. May this story live within you like the blanket that never lets the cold win. Until the next video.